Gentlewomen and gentlemen, today I would like to talk about Christian marriage, sprinkled with a little bit of science. I want to go into the biblical account of marriage, especially Paul's perspective on marriage and sex in Corinthians. Then I want to talk about the science behind coupling, monogamous relationships, and I also want to get into some of the gospels and really dig into the neurobiology of the stuff. Right? But then you might be saying, you're up there in your ivory tower, just being a genius. What makes you look at the plights and concerns of the common man? And I'll tell you this. It's because my grandma asks me when I'm going to get married every single day. Now, she doesn't always do it in the same way. Sometimes she'll be like, hey, listen, number one, number one, you got to take care of your health. And number two, you know what's going to be number two, okay? I don't even need to say it. The words, I don't even need to formulate the words to put them in your head because you know what they are. I want to dance at your wedding. Okay? I don't even need to tell you. You know what it is. I don't need to tell you. I want to dance at your wedding. Doesn't matter. Whatever. You do what you want, right? Or she'll be more straightforward, like, hey, I'm dying over here, right? I'm dying over here. When am I going to dance at your wedding, right? And, I think she just assumes that I ignore everything she says, which is not, strictly speaking, true. Although I do like to poke fun and insult her, but in a very nice and fun way, which she also does to me. So it's a fun little game. But she's got there's a lot of cultural energy embedded in her, right? So she knows a lot about what society's really like, right? She's not a super genius like me in terms of science, which, grabbing things off of PubMed or whatever. But, she knows about the social dimension of life very well. And she's been through a lot, right? Like when she grew up, she didn't even grow up with electricity. Didn't even have an N64. I mean, it's unbelievable. And so, and to her credit, I should say, I have the feeling that when I see someone wearing a wedding ring, it says something about them. They're more respectable, mature, right? It at least proves that someone can tolerate being around them on a regular basis without there being some kind of cataclysm, right? It's like a 5-star Amazon review of somebody, right? And it's not just some random thing that I glitched out of my brain. It's not some glitch in my brain, right? There was this woman who did a study in China with all the involuntary bachelors there. So these Chinese involuntary bachelors, incels, you might say, she's pretty straightforward about it, saying that this is a symptom of the failure of a man, right? Like his life course is not correct. Like he's not on the right course in life, right? And in 2016, for the first time in Canadian history, the amount of single person households was the most common kind, right? So a lot of single people, right? So it's kind of like a generational or a cultural shift towards singlehood, shifting away from marriage, right? And I've been actually to a wedding, my first wedding, and so far the last, that I was invited to by my friend who I was dating at the time. And the bride and groom at this wedding were in their early 20s, right? And I'm like, I was pushing 30 at the time, and it seemed kind of strange, right, for someone to make such a huge decision. Seemed strange to make such a huge decision at that age in your life, right? My grandma married when she was 19, right? But if you look at something called the Hajnal line, this is a really interesting thing that a friend showed me recently. Although if you look at the Wikipedia article, at the beginning, it says something like, this is dangerous Nazi propaganda, right? But then if you scroll down, there's all these neat little pieces of empirical data, right? Which, you could synthesize in different ways, right? It's in some ways a little bit incoherent, right? It's hard to see very definite patterns, but there's a lot of interesting stuff there. So for example, in 15th century Florence, the deadline for a woman to get married would be 19. And once you're getting up to, let's say, 21, going past 21, it's like you're really pushing it there. And 97% of women were married by the age of 25. And, that's 15th century Florence. Now, if you listen to a YouTube personality like Kevin Samuels, he has well over 1 million subscribers. And he talks about the danger zone of women once they get into 27 to 35. That's like, you really gotta put on your marriage boots and get married, right? So it's not uncommon. And of course, these people getting married, the bride and groom, they were young and beautiful and educated, healthy, right? And so they weren't just getting married because of their commitment to the Christian faith or something. I'm not saying that they were, some hardcore atheists or something, but, one of the best parts of this wedding, which was, a Christian ceremony, this beautiful church, right? It was that passage from the 13th verse of 1 Corinthians, right? Written by St. Paul. I'll just call him Paul. Right, which I want to read because it's such an amazing piece of writing. All right, so he says, "Though I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away." Oh, it's so pretty. But, there's two ways to look at it. Number one, it's so beautiful. It's like, oof, hits you right there, right? It's so well written, right? It encompasses this morass, this nebulous concept very well. Another way to look at it is that it's kind of worrying. And I think Nietzsche is devastating in this regard, right? He sees the danger of turning love into something spiritual. And I should say that when Paul uses the English word, love, right? When people translate this as love, they're translating the Greek word agape. Although when you put the Greek word agape into Google Translate, it says like gapi. Agape, it sounds so fun, agape, right? Whereas agape, it's like, I imagine an open mouth, like you're agape, like, oh, angels, right? That kind of thing. So agape, I'm going to call it agape, right? So agape is a spiritual kind of love, which is different than eros, right? So eros is erotic love, right? That like, like damn, right? That kind of thing. So that's a usual distinction. It's not perfect, right? I mean, there's some situations where agape is used to describe, in the book of Samuel, like someone having the hots for their half sister or something like that. But, Martin Luther King had a great definition where he called it an it's overflowing, right? An overflowing love that seeks nothing in return. An understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill towards everybody, right? So this boundless love, right? And the word itself, agape, comes out of agapao or agapao. Very awkward words in English, but agapao means to prefer something, right? Which matches the contemporary understanding of love, right? So when you fall in love, it means you've fallen in love with a specific person, right? An intense preference for someone specific, right? So the sense of boundless love that Paul associates with agape, I'm not going to say agape anymore. With agape, it's a bit confusing, right? Because it's an unselective preferentiality. So how does that work, right? And I actually don't think it's an incoherent idea, right? Because I've experienced this doing Buddhist meditation where they have something called metta, which, again, it's like a spiritualized sort of love, which, is usually translated as loving kindness, but more helpfully, I think, as kindness, right? Which you're trying to just cultivate the feeling of well-wishing for everything and everyone, right? You start with yourself, you move on to someone you really love, then a neutral person, and someone you hate, right? And people like Barbara Fredrickson, who are scientists that study emotions, they point to metta meditation as the most effective one at the beginning, right? Because it's not like you're just watching your thoughts, like in Vipassana meditation, right? Or you're just paying attention to the breath, like in shamatha, right? But you're actively trying to mold your thoughts towards a more positive direction. So it's easier for most people who are getting into meditation to do metta, according to her and my experience as well. And it gives faster results. And we're all about results at this channel, okay? Bottom line. So, and I've had these moments, I call it my Gaia moment, where you just want to nourish and hold the whole world, right? It's silly, but it feels really good. And it makes you a better person, right? And the strange thing about, this passage from 1 Corinthians in verse 13, the strange thing about it, this beautiful passage about love, about agape, is that an earlier part of the book, right, in chapter 7 or verse 7, is that Paul isn't really super keen on marriage. Like, he doesn't see it as like the greatest possible thing or anything like that, right? And I want to read the important section here. So he says, "As for the questions raised in your letter, a man does well to abstain from all commerce with women." Now, there's some debate whether or not he's just quoting something that someone else said, like, "Oh, I believe that men should stay away from women," right? And then he goes on to reply. It's not clear if he's quoting or if he's repeating that and endorsing it. I think it's the latter. I think he's actually endorsing it, and we'll see why. So I'll continue. So he says, "To avoid the danger of fornication, let every man keep his own wife, and every man her own husband. Let every man give his wife what is her due, and every woman do the same by her husband. He, not she, claims a right over her body, as she, not he, claims a right over his. Do not starve one another, unless perhaps you do so for a time by mutual consent, to have more freedom for prayer. Come together again, or Satan will tempt you, weak as you are. I say this by way of concession. I am not imposing a rule on you. I wish you were all in the same state as myself. But each of us has his own endowment from God, one to live this way, another that. To the unmarried and to the widows, I would say that they will do well to remain in the same state as myself. But if they have not the gift of continence, let them marry. Better to marry than to feel the heat of passion." So, it's not really a ringing endorsement of getting married. In fact, he's saying, if you really can't control yourself, you might as well get married, right? But it's not like, this is the goal of life, right? To find somebody to pair up, to love and support each other. Although I would also say that Paul doesn't, or in my estimation, doesn't think that, you should just like keep to yourself and be like, I'm going to get mine. I'm not here to make friends, right? He's not like that, right? He's all about like unity and cooperation between everybody, right? And so don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that he's some kind of like antisocial monster, but he knew that agape was a distant dream for most people, right? Not everyone's just going to like read Corinthians 7 and be like, okay, cool, I'm just going to love everybody from now on, right? So he makes a concession. He says, well, erotic love needs some kind of expression, right? And from his perspective, marriage is a way to fix, what's translated as fornication is porneia, right? In order to avoid burning or passion, which is the Greek word pyroste, right? And the way it's transliterated into English is like the first 4 letters are pyro, right? It's where we get fire from, right? And I mean, he's kind of right. Like I've talked to many a married man, right? And they're generally pretty cynical about romantic love, right? Because they think that kind of dies down after, a little while, and you have to become more attuned to different aspects of relationship, not necessarily ones that would be considered worse than intense romantic erotic passion, right? But that plays a different role later on, right? Like it kind of like cools you off, right? And the word porneia is a tricky one because kind of like the word porn today, it can mean very different things to different people, right? And there were different cultures when Paul was writing this stuff. In the same way, there's many different cultures now that have different understandings of sex and porn, right? And so the Greek use of the word porneia was a more generic one that described sexual intercourse in general, right? So just sex. And porne meant a sex man or a sex woman, right? And the difference is that in Jewish culture, porneia was a catch-all for anything they considered like yucky Gentile behavior, which was a lot. So, for them, porneia, which they would have thought more of in terms of sexual immorality, right? Fornication. It would have been masturbation, homosexuality, extramarital sex, a woman on top, pegging and oral sex. So a lot of different things. And another important thing to consider is that porneia was used in contrast, or I should say against the term mihia, right? And mihia is related to adultery, right? So women in Greek society at this time, like 2,000 years ago, they were technically like regulated property of men, right? In order to maintain what they call legitimacy, right? And so there was respectable women and non-respectable women, right? And if you had sex with a respectable woman, whether or not she wanted to or not, whether or not she was married, you were violating someone else's property, and a man's property specifically. And so as a result, there was a big demand for women that were non-respectable, so to speak. And the ancient slave trade was in large part all about commodifying women, right? To bring them into the marketplace, the sexual marketplace. And I mean, it's pretty grim, trigger warning. Like they basically commodified them to be sex toys for men, right? And it wasn't really a big deal for Greek men to go into a brothel, right? And discharge that sexual energy they had. And so they figured that this was an unfortunate but necessary thing to do in order to stabilize society, because they figured the sexual competition that would result from mihia, from adultery, would be really destructive and tear society apart, right? And I mean, the Old Testament doesn't really condemn visiting prostitutes, although in Second Temple Judaism that changed, right? And yeah, so the Greeks were very liberal with attitudes to sex. I would compare them more to secular society now. But, they also had their limits. And Paul mentions this. He's like, even the Greeks are not cool with a guy sleeping with a stepmom, right? Like they have their limits, right? But what I find interesting too is that, I think Nietzsche makes some very, very fair and important points about Paul's spiritual project and its dangers. But I think it's worth mentioning that there were understandable material circumstances that led to Paul's thinking. I mean, not entirely, right? But, one thing that I think is worth mentioning is that these brothels, right, these Corinthian brothels were kind of a living hell, right? Because you'd have these women who were sex slaves, right? Just like their entire life was to be used for sexual gratification by strangers, right? And there was no concept of, sexually transmitted diseases, although there was a concept of pollution, one which Paul was very attuned to, right? And so you'd have these human beings, these women, who would be used as sex toys, and then, there would be babies, right? You can find articles where they dig up brothels from Roman times, and there'd be all these skeletons of infants, right? That'd be discarded by these prostitutes, right? Because there's no birth control or anything like that, and they can't take care of these kids, right? So a really awful situation. And, because Paul is so concerned with pollution, right? He points out, he's like, if in Corinthians, that like, if you have sex with a prostitute, you're uniting your body with them, right? Like you're polluting yourself, right? And he was very concerned with cleanliness. And another really interesting thing is that when you look at research coming out in evolutionary anthropology, especially, when they look at the development of monogamy, right, there's some evidence to suggest that sexually transmitted diseases played a big role in the enforcement of monogamy, right? Because if you have these really big cities and you have all sorts of people mingling together, there's going to be a lot of infections, right? And so there's more of a pressure to be like, okay, you get this person, you do your thing with them, and that's it, right? There's no more spreading around. And I mean, it's crazy. Like when you look at some of the remains that they dig up from thousands of years ago, and they test them, there's some huge percentage of them that have hepatitis B, which I think is worth mentioning is still incurable. Like you can have some treatment for its chronic manifestation, but there's still no way to kill it. There are vaccinations, but man, the history of that is grim indeed. And for example, AIDS, which was a huge issue because of promiscuity, right? You'd have certain people, right, who were considered super spreaders, right, that would have hundreds of sexual partners. And so it spread very quickly, right? So there's something to be said about monogamy. Of course, there's some complexity to it, right? It depends on how infective, or is infective a word? I'm sorry. How virulent it is, or how lethal the infection is, I should say. Right? Because it might not be a virus, and then virulent would be inappropriate. Okay, so when it comes to piroste, right, burning up. So it was a common belief in antiquity throughout that sexual desire was literally burning you up, right? It was a fire, and you needed to extinguish it, or else there's going to be trouble, right? And I mean, the biology that they understood back then was almost nothing, but it was nonetheless an important insight, right? So, for example, Louis C.K., an American comedian, he had this joke about how cities should put a red tag on dicks with an unacceptable PSI level, right? And and that male orgasm is just something that you need to do so you don't murder people, right? And, he was in the news for, doing these weird sexual things with women that he knew, right? And almost destroyed his career forever, but he's making a comeback. He's a really funny guy. Real shame what happened. But anyway, so Paul made no secret that his personal opinion is celibacy is superior, right? But he also emphasized that what he's telling the listeners or the readers is for their own good, right? He's not saying like, you got to do this or you're a loser in life, right? Like his guiding principle is the Holy Spirit, right? So, or the fruits of the Holy Spirit. So you got love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness. And he appreciated that everybody's different, right? Like not everybody is suited to celibacy and not everybody is suited to marriage, right? And who knows what you have in between, right? So he's pretty open-minded, and you can also see where he clearly fails, right? Like where he loses his temper, like in 2 Corinthians, where he's like, oh, yo, you don't like me being, like he's a complicated person, a very interesting person. And, there's definitely some unfortunate narratives that exist in secular society. And I'm not saying everybody believes this, but it's like this idea floating around, which I've seen authors like Amir Levine and Rachel Heller summarize in their book Attached, where they talk about how, this ideal relationship being one with completely self-sufficient people, and there's clear boundaries between them. And, if you become dependent on the other person in any way, you're kind of going a little kooky, right? And you got to differentiate. You got to develop a greater sense of self, right? The worst thing that could happen is that you end up needing your partner. It's just like, oh, it's like an addiction, right? Like, no, you got to be composed, right? You can't just depend on other people. It's a very individualistic approach, right? And that's codependency that they're trying to avoid. And so it's something reasonable to it, right? I'm not saying that the exact opposite of this is the best or anything like that. But what they point out is that from a biological point of view, depending on your partner is more like a fact rather than something you choose to do, right? And one thing that led to this concept of self-sufficiency is behaviorism from the early 20th century, where, psychologists figured that children should be kind of like treated like little adults, right? You don't give them too much attention. If they cry, just, ignore it for a little bit. If they're in hospital, don't touch them and pamper them, right? And, if they act up too much, just send them to foster care, right? And, as you might expect, this really screwed up a lot of kids, right? And it was actually this guy named John Bowlby, who is a very important figure in developmental psychology, right? Where, he was a casualty of this rough style of upbringing, and his parents were essentially strangers to him. The nannies that he had would leave unexpectedly, and he was sent to boarding school when he was really young. And, a part of that is, training people to be servants of the British Empire and making them kind of callous, hard-hearted people to make some tough decisions, right? But that's for another podcast. But, as a way of making sense of his own suffering, right, he went to study psychology and work with juvenile delinquents. And he noticed that the most pathological children, right, who just could not behave properly, one common factor was their caregiving environment in early life, right? So their relationship with their parents, especially with their mother, right? If they were abused, they would kind of turn out a little crazy, right? Which for us now is common sense, but apparently this was like groundbreaking for them to some degree, right? And so he looked to ethology, right? The study of animal behavior. And he noticed there was this big similarity between human beings and other mammals, when it comes to the behavior of offspring, right? When they're separated from their parents. So, they cry, they cling, they look around, right? These are basic survival mechanisms, right? Because if you have a baby who's like, screw you, I don't need anybody, right? Self-made, right? They're going to just starve and die, right? And given the fact that humans are way more helpless than any other mammal, then there's like this built-in attachment behavioral system that's always like looking for an attachment figure, right? Saying like, okay, do I have protection? Do I have support and care, right? And it needs that. It's like food and water. And I'll get into the biology of that momentarily. So, whether or not this figure exists has really important consequences, right? So the more a child feels that there is an attachment figure, the more it can be sociable, confident, playful, and curious, right? So good behavior, right? And this is paradoxical, right? It's actually called the dependency paradox, right? Because it's like, if you have support and you know that there's someone you can count on, it's actually necessary for the brain to feel safe, right? To become independent, right? And, this obviously doesn't just disappear after you turn 18, right? This stays with you your whole life. Although the way that it manifests and the way that you can handle it obviously changes, right? Because you do become stronger and more independent, right? And one of the best ways to illustrate this, or one of the most important findings of this kind of research, right, was what's called attachment theory, right? And Andrew Huberman has a great extended podcast on this, but I'll summarize it a bit here. Right, so the big thing here is the strange situation test, right? So you have like let's say 12-month-old child, right? It comes there with a parent to this experiment room, right? And the experimenter is like, a young, friendly researcher. And there's a bunch of fun toys for the kid to play with, right? The kid comes in, looking at all these little toys, like, oh, it's really cool, right? They play around with these toys. And while this is happening, right, the parent gets taken away to another room for like 3 minutes, let's say. And the kid starts freaking out. He's like, what? I don't care about these toys anymore. Where's my attachment figure, right? Where's my mom? Where's my dad? Right? They start crying. They're like banging at the door, right? And they can even turn violent, start throwing toys at the assistant, right? The researcher. And once the parent comes back, right, the kid has the attachment figure and can relax, and then they can become independent again, right? And so the attachment provides a secure base from which children engage in their exploratory drive, right? Now, that's the best case scenario, right? Where the parent leaves, kid freaks out, parent comes back, kid is happy, independent, curious, right? All these good things. That's the best case scenario. And that's called secure attachment, basically, right? And that takes up, let's say, represents half the population, right? But there's other kids who are different, right? And, there's some details about these different kids that I'm not really going to go into, but just think of it in terms of anxiety and avoidance, right? So there's some kids that want to punish the parent for leaving. There's some kids that want to avoid the parent, right? And it's important to not think of these as necessarily maladaptive, although they can definitely become that, right? But it's like a kid needs to be able to figure out what works for them, right? And it might be that what works for them is to just avoid the parent out of hurt, right? And just to take it all in themselves, right? And that can develop to like an extreme level of independence later on in life, right? But it can also make you the kind of person who just avoids other people, right? Because of fear of abandonment and stuff like that, right? So it kind of makes you a little crazy. So, there's also a fourth one. So you have something called disorganized attachment, which is pretty rare, thankfully. And that's when the kid just like has no idea what to do, right? Like they just start hitting themselves, banging their heads against the wall. right? They're inconsolable. This usually happens when the kid is like severely traumatized, right? And it's also worth mentioning here that a child is usually most attached to the mom, right? But there's cultural norms that play into this as well, right? So there's this woman named Ruth Feldman, who's the professor of psychology and neuroscience at Bar-Ilan University. You know, she looked at straight mothers who are the primary caregivers. She looked at straight fathers who were secondary caregivers and gay fathers who were primary caregivers, right? And basically, to summarize, she found that mothers and fathers had different parts of their brain light up, right, when they were taking care of the kid. Mother was more in the emotional center and the father in the mentalization center, right? And then in the gay fathers, she found that they had activation in both, right? And she really wants to drive home the point that it's not so much what gender you are, but it's that your brain is actually plastic, right? So she mentions that a primary caregiver, that's a man, that's a father, right, can actually have their brain chemistry change in order to provide the necessary emotional support and intellectual support, or not that they're having like philosophical discussions with the kid, right, but to be able to like verbalize what they're thinking, give them guidance, like everything that a kid needs, right? And the reason for this, she points out, is kind of a dark one. It's that it was really common for most of history for healthy young women to die during childbirth, which meant that neighbors and relatives had to kind of step up, right, no matter who they were, right? So the biological patterns of being a caregiver don't depend on gender, right? They're flexible and needs to be like that because it's really important that infants survive, right? And the most amazing example of how biology responds to relationship is this one from the 70s by the scientist named Singer. I tried to find the original study, but I could only get the quotation in a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers by Robert Sapolsky, which is amazing, right? So there's this really sick kid that gets taken to the hospital, and he was eating okay, but his growth was really stunted. And when they checked his blood, he was really low on growth hormones. And anyway, he was assigned a nurse who was like super affectionate to him, right? Gave him a lot of TLC. And after 100 days of this, they checked his blood again, and his growth hormones doubled, right? Doubled. And his, his whole physiology was greatly improved with, clear objective markers, right? Like your growth hormones. And what's really amazing is that once the nurse took a 3-week vacation, all of the measures that they found were getting better plummeted back to the level that they were at when the child was admitted to hospital, right? And then when she came back, all the numbers went back up, right? And so the way Robert Sapolsky summarizes this is, the rate at which this child was depositing calcium in his long bones could be successfully predicted by his proximity to a loved one, right? You can't ask for a clearer demonstration that what is going on in our heads influences every cell in our body, right? So pretty crazy stuff, right? And so it's worth mentioning that growth hormones are secreted by the pituitary gland. This is dangly, pea-sized piece of meat at the inner center of the brain, which in turn is regulated by the hypothalamus just above, right? And so the hypothalamus, it's like the big hormone boss. It regulates stimulatory and inhibitory hormones, right? And given how central it is, and anatomically, right? It's like right inside the inner part of your brain, right? It should be no surprise that this is ancient, right? Because the way that evolution works, it's like a tinkerer and an adder. It adds everything on. It's like, right? It just builds things up, right? So everything at the very center is is most likely to be very old. And in fact, all vertebrate life has that, and even some invertebrate life, like some worms, have something similar, right? So the common ancestor for that is really, really old. It's a core part of being an animal. And another example of this biological effect of relationship is this fMRI study by James Cohen. And I mean, okay, fMRI studies is like looking at, stuff lighting up in the brain. It's not super useful, but it's nice empirical data, right? It's something sturdy to talk about, even if the conclusions are kind of obvious, right? So, in this study by James Cohen, they'd place women in an fMRI machine, and they would tell them, okay, we're gonna give your legs an electric shock, right? And it's not a crazy shock, but it's not really easy to be chilled out in a situation like that, right? And so, for example, they would notice that their right anterior insula would light up, that their superior frontal gyrus would light up, that their hypothalamus would light up, right? And so the right anterior insula is a big chunk of meat on the inside, right? Not quite on the outside of the brain. And it deals with feelings that warn you of problems like thirst and pain, right? Makes sense. It's like there's pain incoming, right? And then something like the superior frontal gyrus is something that works with memory and deliberative thought, right? So it's like, oh, there's going to be pain, right? She's probably thinking about the pain, right? But that's the least interesting aspect of it, right? Because the first group just got the shock. They were in the machine by themselves, right? The second group, they held the hand of a stranger while they're getting a shock. And the third group, they held the hand of their spouses, right? And there was a dramatic difference between the different groups when it came to how stressful this event was, right? And unsurprisingly, if it was a spouse, the stress was lower, right? So physical reactions change based on who's around you, right? Now, of course, if the couple hated each other, that would not be the case, right? But anyway, if the absence of a loved one changes the way that our bones deposit calcium, it's not a surprise that, your stress might be lowered if a loved one is near you, right? So understandably, attachment plays a big role in adult relationships, right? And, you can look at it almost like a compass, right? So you have like high avoidance, high anxiety, right? And low avoidance and low anxiety, right? So you can be high avoidance and high anxiety, which is a fearful avoidant, where you have a negative perception of yourself and of other people, or you can be low anxiety and low avoidance, which is you like yourself and you like other people. But that's not really something that's for me. Okay, so now we can get into the Bible, right? So I already talked about Paul, right? But when it comes to the Gospels, I think it's really interesting that Christ talks about how important it is that when two people get married, they become one flesh, right? So when the Pharisees ask him about divorce, he says, haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate, right? Now, I hope you don't think that it's too much of a stretch to go from attachment theory to this passage. But I think that even though developmental psychology discovered all this stuff later on, like, in the 20th century, I think people throughout history kind of realize, right, that people who spend a lot of time together, like, they are bonded, right? It's not just two independent, fully self-sufficient creatures just kind of hanging out with each other, right? And they also probably noticed that they transmitted infections or polluted each other's bodies. Right? So they wouldn't have had the same sophisticated and advanced conceptual framework that we have with science, but they made, I'm sure, similar observations, right? And anyway, so what I think is really useful in looking at Christ's message in Matthew is that at the time, the Pharisees were debating divorce, right? Which was a big deal back then, right? As it kind of is now. And it can be quite devastating for people. And I'll get into that a bit later, right? But Christ kind of sidesteps the question, and he says that divorce is a symptom of a much bigger problem, which the Greek word is Sklerokardia, right? So sklero is hard, right? Like sclerosis. And cardia is obviously heart, right? Like cardiology. So Sklerokardia. And he says that if you ditch your wife for anything less than her being unfaithful or cheating on you, that's actually a form of adultery, right? Because you're abandoning this person, right? And so when he tells his disciples that the real problem is hard-heartedness or sklerokardia, they don't say like, oh, okay, so then we should just focus on opening our hearts, right? No, they say, well, forget it. I'm just not going to get married, right? They just give up, right? And then Christ, instead of being like, oh, you guys, you should be more loving, right? He's like, you know what? I bet you don't even know how to avoid marriage, right? So he kind of claps back, as the kids say, right? More exactly, he says, that conclusion cannot be taken in by everybody, but only by those who have the gift. There are some eunuchs who were so born from the mother's womb, some were made so by men, and some have made themselves so for the love of the kingdom of heaven. Some have made themselves so for love of the kingdom of heaven. Take this in, you whose hearts are large enough for it, right? And so that last part, right, he's like, take this in, you whose hearts are large enough for it, right? It's like a sarcastic jab, right? Because if their hearts were large enough, right, would they really be like challenging him on this, right? Like avoiding this thing? Like if you had a big open heart, like why wouldn't you want to be married, right? Like you'd have all this love inside you, and like it would be so wonderful to like care for somebody, right? To have that love appreciated and redoubled, right? And you know, it's funny that he makes this sarcastic jab, right? Because the chapter begins with this glowing reverence of marriage, that you found in Genesis, followed by an explanation that Moses had to allow divorce as a concession for a sklerokardia, right? I'm just going to say hard-heartedness, although they're both such awkward words. Hard-heartedness. So, you know, if my heart was big enough, I wouldn't be castrating myself to begin with, right? Like it should kind of just flow naturally, right? And you know, this might seem like, oh, like why are we looking at these like little words and phrases? And you know, these have had incredible impact, right? So the most obvious of which is the Russian sect called the Skoptsi, right? Where the hardcore members, the male members, they'd remove their penis and their testicles, and the women would lop off their breasts, their labia minora and their clitoris, right? They'd use knives and red hot irons, right? Very, very intense believers. I was going to say very, very Russian, but I don't want to get into, you know, stereotypes of people, especially when they're at war right now. Anyway, so these Skoptsi, like they weren't some minor sect. They were pretty popular. At some point, apparently they even numbered up to 100,000 people. So much so that the government started to get concerned. They're like, okay, we gotta stop this, right? They started cracking down on them, and they've mostly waned in the past few decades. But you know, just goes to show that this is not some unimportant passage the meaning of which we can just kind of skip past, right? What does it mean to be castrated for the sake of God, right? For the kingdom of God, for the love of the kingdom of God, right? And ostensibly, if you're a believer and you think these words utter from, I don't know, the Son of God or whatever you believe in, right? Like you have to take it seriously, right? And I think that if we look at the previous chapters, we can refine our understanding of the lesson that we're trying to be taught here. So in Matthew 5 and 18, Christ calls for various kinds of mutilation, right? Such as gouging out your eyes if they look at someone lustfully, or amputating your limbs if they cause you to stumble, right? It's like, what does he mean by this? This is so extreme, right? Like, even if you take it figuratively, right, it's quite the statement, right? What if, now this is my opinion, right? What if the point he's trying to make is that the integrity of your heart is more important than your body, than your foot or your eye, right? Because if you really cared, right, about the fruits of your heart, right, like your behavior, all the things you do in life, if you really cared, you'd be so careful, in fact, that you would mutilate yourself, that you would cut your body off, right? That's how important it is, right, to have an open heart, right, a loving heart, right? And Paul, I think, knew that Christ wasn't talking literally, especially because, he snipes at people in his letter to the Galatians, which is a pretty vituperative, to quote Dale Martin, vituperative attack on his audience or message to his audience, right? So he knows that Christ is talking about being a spiritual eunuch, right? And, when Paul wrote, I wish you were all in the same celibate state as myself, it's not as if he felt agape all the time, right? He didn't feel like a fully free, unattached, and self-sufficient person all the time, right? Like I said, he lost his temper in text in Corinthians, right? And more importantly, like, he points out his flaws, right? Like he has this letter to the Romans where he writes, again, quite beautifully about his psychological struggles, which I think anybody could relate to, right? So he says, my own actions bewilder me. What I do is not what I wish to do, but something which I hate. Of this I am certain, that no principle of good dwells in me, that is, in my natural self. Praiseworthy intentions are always ready to hand, but I cannot find my way to the performance of them. It is not the good my will prefers, but the evil my will disapproves that I find myself doing. Inwardly, I applaud God's disposition, but I observe another disposition in my lower self, which raises war against the disposition of my conscience, and so I am handed over as a captive to that disposition towards sin which my lower self contains. Pitiable creature that I am, who is to set me free from a nature thus doomed to death? Well, obviously for him, the answer is Jesus Christ. But, it makes me wonder, like, how does attachment theory help us, right? How does it help us become free from a nature doomed to death? That's quite a question, right? And so, if you look at popular books, right, like the one called Attached, right? I mean, there's something a little bit cartoonish about it. And, I'm not putting the book down. I'm just saying that there's a certain limit, right? Maybe it's not really the place for the book to answer such, deep religious questions, right? But, there's a kind of writing which is like a little bit Disney, right? So, they'll say something like, Trevor did not stay available for long. He quickly found a great partner, and they have been together ever since. They traveled around the world and got married and had a couple of kids. He's a wonderful father and husband, right? Like it's almost like a little bit too glassy, you know? And they tend to talk about people who are young. They're not ill, right? They're not dying, right? Mortality doesn't really come up, right? So Paul's talking about something much deeper, and I guess Christ as well, right? And, you know, for some people, long-term coupling might be a great choice, but not everyone's luck is so stellar, right? So what if there's no intimate union to build a secure base and charge up your exploratory drive? Now, Paul, as you might know, he had a tough life, right? He was sometimes homeless. He went without food or water for long periods of time. He got beaten up a lot. He got whipped. He got stoned. He got thrown into prison, right? And, you know, he was, man, a sturdy guy, right? He would travel a lot around Asia Minor, but, you know, he had pretty bad physical health, right? And he prayed to God to remove what he called the thorn in his flesh, right? It's not clear what ailments he had, although there's a lot of, I think, well-founded speculation, right? And he wound up living his whole life with this unspecified ailment, which is so severe that he describes it as Satan torturing him, right? And in his letter to the Galatians, he even thanks them that they didn't reject him on account of his illness, right? And there's also evidence that he might have had bad eyesight, and he talks about getting insulted because of his ugly appearance and his voice, which means he might have had a speech impediment, right? Like in 2 Corinthians, he's kind of standing up for himself because people are like, oh, he's weak, right? And, you know, there's also evidence that he, if you look at contemporary case studies of neurological disorders, it suggests Paul might have had temporal lobe epilepsy, right? Which would explain the visions he describes in 2 Corinthians and the conversion experience on the road to Damascus, right? And of course, he considers himself a murderer because of St. Stephen's death, right? So, you know, he's a sick, ugly, epileptic, stuttering, homeless jailbird with murderous tendencies, right? It's quite a stack of issues there for Paul, right? And despite all that, right, Paul asks people to rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and give thanks in all circumstances, right? It's a tall order, but that particular line from Thessalonians, right, inspired some victims in Nazi concentration camps like Corrie ten Boom to be grateful despite being stuck in a flea-ridden environment, these barracks, right? And there is evidence, empirical evidence, that it's possible to positively influence neurological function through spiritual practice, right? Now, again, I'll just present some little interesting snippets, right? So, you know, Andrew Newberg, he studied Christian centering prayer and Tibetan Buddhist meditation. And after many years of practice, they were able to decrease activity in their parietal lobes, which led to a sense of timelessness and spacelessness, right? And this experience, you know, they would couch it in the lingo of their religion, right? So they might say they're entering the living presence of God, or they might say they're entering a state of absolute awareness of the universe, right? And, you know, if you look at a parietal lobe, it's responsible for orientation, and sometimes when a tumor pops up in that part of the brain, patients talk about how different parts of their body becomes alien to them, right? And so in a more normal circumstance, you might lose your sense of self when there's a sunset or you're making love, right? And what's interesting is that while your parietal lobe activity is lowered, right, and your sense of self starts to dissolve, the thalamus activity goes up, right? And the thalamus is responsible for sending sensory information to different parts of the brain, right? Including the frontal cortex, right? And without it, we'd not have the experience of consciousness, right? And normally these two things are coupled, right? So the thalamus and the parietal lobe, they're coupled, right? So they both charge up if you're dreaming, and they calm down if you're in dreamless sleep, right? But during certain kinds of meditation and prayer, thalamus goes up, parietal lobe goes down, right? Which means your lucidity becomes stronger, but your sense of concern for yourself starts to disappear, right? So you become more lucid of everything around you, right? You become more lucid about being connected to the world around you, right? You kind of get out of your little shell of concern, right? And there's like Paul's insistence on praying without ceasing, I think is really important to underscore here, because to underline it, because negative life experiences are much more likely to get burned into the brain, whereas positive life experiences are much more likely to be forgotten, right? And one really amazing study that Andrew Huberman mentions in one of his podcasts is that there was a study in the 60s, right, where people had a bunch of their different parts of their brain stimulated with, I guess, some kind of stimulating machine, right? Electrodes or whatever, right? And you would expect that, they wire it up to like the sex part of the brain, and they like jam electricity there, and you just feel like you're, like having this amazing lovemaking session, right? But the really scary finding here is that the one part of their brain that people enjoyed having stimulated the most was one which was described as frustration and mild anger, right? So feeling frustrated and mildly angry, or angry, whichever way you want to put it. So frustration and mild anger is the most pleasurable thing to experience, according to the study, right? And back then, apparently the ethics in the 60s were a little lax, because they wouldn't be able to do this now, right? But this blows my mind, right? Because it explains so much, right? Like if you go through Twitter, so much of it is just people like sniping at each other. And I mean, I have an experience sometimes where I'm just like disgusted by it. I'm like, this is just poison. I need to get away from it. And then another part of me is just like scrolling and scrolling. I'm like, what an idiot, stupid, right? Like, it's pleasurable. It's fun to like condemn people morally, right? To insult them, to attack them, to mob them, right? To be angry at things they said, not like foaming at the mouth, but just like, that kind of thing, right? And this isn't just an academic curiosity, right? Because you can find research where, it shows social media platforms are exploiting all these negative triggers, right, that people have, right, to signal boost really polarizing stuff, because it activates the limbic system like crazy, much more than positive, peaceful stuff, right? Like if it's just like, oh, I just want everyone to get along, right? Everyone's going to scroll past that to find a post that's like, these people are Nazis, right? That kind of thing. And so, as Paul puts it in his memorable letter to Philippians, he says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And now, this is interesting, right? Because these sound like nice things, like, oh, let's think about pure stuff, right? But it doesn't feel that good to think about pure stuff, ironically enough, right? The brain is just like looking for dirt and gossip and just all the ugly stuff, right? And it's interesting to me because normally there's a certain flavor that is attached to Christianity, especially Paul, right? Which is that like they're against pleasure, right? That it's like this severe, austere rejection of the world. And I mean, again, if you read The Antichrist by Nietzsche, it's like a devastating attack on this kind of psychology and how it like poisons people and makes them weak, right? It turns them against the world. However, I think that, again, it's true that this is dangerous, but like one really interesting part of Paul's project, right, where he specifically tries to flip the world upside down, right, where he has parts where he talks about how he wants, or he sees God as turning weakness into strength, right, to shame the strong, or turning ignorance into wisdom, or turning nothing into something, right? Just like flipping the world around, right? And I think one way in which that's actually kind of necessary for scientific knowledge, which again Nietzsche totally recognizes, right, is that Paul talks about how his idea of resurrection is that the psyche, right, the body soul, which is buried in the ground once you die, that's turned into pneuma, right, which is usually translated as, the physical turning into the spiritual, right? But for Paul, pneuma, or the spirit, is like a physical thing, right? When he talks about pneuma, like he considers the stars and the sun to be pneuma, right? And so apparently, like, he seems to have this idea where after death, like, we become stars, right? Like, and that's so bizarre. Like, you kind of have to turn away from reality, like reject reality and decouple it, right, into something else to be able to think such things, which is kind of how science works, right? Because if you were to tell people like, oh, actually, you might look like a person, but billions of years ago, everything was totally different, and there was these stars that made these little invisible building blocks of the world that like are constantly changing. Like it's just so weird, right? And so there's something to be said for Paul's project, right? And our immediate instinct, right, is to seek this like anger and frustration, right? Whereas he's saying like it takes effort, right, to be true, noble, pure, lovely, admirable, right? And anyway, so how does this all translate into something really practical? So I want to end on this post that I made on Reddit, which is, as you know, a place for really happy and well-adjusted people, right? And I think it's the most popular thing I've written, even though it was just a little writing exercise I had, because there's this guy who posted something in Stoicism about how his life is falling apart, and the advice I gave him was like really popular. And by popular, I mean people upvoted it. And upvoting is when you go like this on your mouse, shows your approval of something. It doesn't really, mean anything. Like, you don't get paid for this, right? But it just shows that it's resonating with people. And someone specifically replied saying that they found it very helpful. And just so you know that I'm a pillar of the online community, I want to read you the post and my reply. So the title of this post is "Relationship Just Fallen Apart, Approaching 40, No Support Network, No Long-Term Financial Security because of Cost of Living, Finding It Hard to Keep Myself Together." So that's the title. And so he says, "My relationship has just ended. It was very passionate, but feelings cooled in my significant other, and I was just sort of left dangling. I'm taking it very hard because I'm unable to let go of attachment. I know. My 40th birthday is approaching with the attendant midlife crisis. I am living in a foreign country because I have no opportunities or family in my home country. I live in an expensive capital city and am unable to move elsewhere because of complicated financial and bureaucratic reasons. I have employment, good health, I hope. I save a little and do not buy anything but food and other necessities, but life is precarious with inflation and cost of living crisis. I have no property or prospect of retiring. If I lose my job, I'll be on the streets probably. I live alone and have no real support network if things hit the fan. I am trying to be as stoical as possible and do what is in my power, but my prospects are objectively poor. Stoicism teaches us that we can't control external forces, but we can control our reactions to them. Yet my emotions, rejection, anxiety, alienation, hit me with the force of a sledgehammer, and I feel physically stunned by them. I'm unable to control them effectively, and I feel mentally weak. And now here I come to the rescue. All right, so I tell him, as someone a few years younger, it feels inappropriate to give advice. So just think of this as a way to organize my thoughts about what you said. So I'm super humble, guys. I'm just amazing. So I said, I think sometimes it can be unhelpful to frame reactions as something we control and external forces as something we don't. We are often prisoners to our neurochemical storms, and yet we are also masters of manipulating the world to our advantage, which is the gist I'm getting from your post. Not only are you getting crushed by your feelings, but you recognize that there are many potential avenues for changing your external circumstances for the better. They're just frustratingly out of reach at the moment. I like to think of Seneca's approach that focuses on managing expectations, which grow out of unchecked idealism. There seems to be a cluster of implicit expectations in your post. You expect relationships to be passionate, long-lasting, mutual, painless. You expect to live a long and healthy life with affordable housing, with reasonable bureaucracies, with helpful social networks. You expect to control emotions that accurately reflect your situation, like rejection, anxiety, and alienation. So rather than controlling emotions or reactions, it might be more helpful to look at it as growing an understanding of limits. Weakness, failure, loneliness, and pain are the norm for most people most of the time. Although we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that strength, success, connection, and joy are possible and worth striving for. The way this lesson was driven home to me was when my lungs were shutting down and I struggled to breathe for hours. At the time, I was going through all sorts of relationship and financial troubles, but the circumstances whittled my expectations down to just being able to breathe again. It was a painful and frightening experience, but it also came with a tremendous freedom and sense of appreciation for what had previously been a series of burdens and complications. And I say, not sure if this is meaningful to you, but wish you all the best in your path to recovering from what sounds like a rough situation. And I want to end with a quote which summarizes this. It's from, I think, the 12th century, from an Islamic scholar named Al-Qurtubi, right? And he puts this, I guess, apocryphal story about David in the Bible. So he quotes David and he says, so the Islamic word for David is Dawood, right? I guess I'll just call him David. So David said, "O Lord, show me your most hidden blessing." Then Allah replied, "Breathe, Dawood. Breathe, David. Who counts this blessing night and day?" So, I mean, it's a little corny, right? But when it comes to corny expressions, like what they're actually getting at, like if you were to really unpack them and, spend an hour going through it, I think they have a lot of wisdom, right? And so, yeah, marriage and stuff like that. So, fruit of the Spirit, again, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness. Those are pretty cool things. Although, it's not the only thing in life. But yeah, thanks for tuning into the Andrei Victor Georgescu Show, the podcast. And if you made it this far, then you must be me, because I did this thing. But anyway, until next time, bye-bye.